Tonight we're going to Ruth chapter 3. We've had a session in Ruth chapter 1, a session in Ruth chapter 2. Tonight we're going to Ruth chapter 3. And remember that the kind of the overarching driver behind all this is God's plan. I think especially in doing the research for Ruth 3 and Ruth 4, it really became apparent how God is working out his plan in the midst of us. He's working with us where we want to work with him. Sometimes he's just moving powerfully. Like, for example, when the angel showed up to Mary and said, "You're going to give birth to the Messiah," that's God picking a person that he knows will work with him and then moving powerfully to bring forth his plan. That same kind of thing is going on in Ruth. God is setting up types of the Messiah. God is moving toward the Messiah through the line of David. There's just a tremendous amount going on in here. Now, verse 1 of Ruth chapter 3 starts out, "And Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, 'My daughter, should I not seek rest for you that it will be well with you?'" And there's a lot here that we can unpack. The first is when Naomi speaks up and says, and so many times, if anything's going to happen, somebody has to move first. And we have to pray and think about, when do we move? When do we move and when do we wait for the other party to move? Here, Naomi speaks up. First of all, she calls Ruth her daughter, indicating again the tightness of the relationship. And then, "Should I not seek rest for you?" And this is not like retirement. When it says, "Shall I not seek rest for you?" It's not talking about retirement and that kind of rest. But we're dealing with the ancient culture, which was a tough culture. In fact, even actually up until really quite recent modern times, the world has just been a difficult place. I mean, just think, if I want hot water, I go over to my sink, I hit the tap on the left, and after a minute or so, hot water comes out. Somebody from the early 1800s or 1700s or before that would just be absolutely astounding. I had a book, I lost it in one of my moves. I'm sorry I did. It was called Listening to America, and it was a book of American idioms and how Americans express themselves. And it said really until the 1800s, there was no idiom in the English language for anything being easy. Always a piece of cake, easy as pie, like falling off a log backwards, no problem. Those idioms didn't exist because nothing was easy. And so that's the background, the cultural background, if you will, the temporal background, if you will, should I not seek rest for you? Because you wanted to have men in your life to help with some of the hard work. If we go to Ruth chapter 1, in Ruth chapter 1, this is the same thing that Naomi said to the women when they were coming out of Moab. Here in Ruth chapter 1, Naomi is heading back into Bethlehem, back into Judah. And in verse 9, she says to the two daughters-in-law, she says, "May Yahweh grant you find rest, each of you in the house of her husband." So that was the same idea, that a woman would get married, there would be men around to help with the work, and so there would be rest. So that's what's going on here in Ruth chapter 3. So when Naomi says, "My daughter, should I not seek rest for you, that it will be well with you?" that's absolutely cultural, because in that culture, the young men didn't approach the young women didn't approach the young men. It was the parents who worked out a marriage relationship. It was all arranged marriages, and it was the parents that worked it out. So when she says, "Should I not seek rest for you?" then she's stepping up to the plate, taking her responsibility for what she needs to do in the culture, and she's going to get that done. And we can bring that forward as one of those little lessons for us, because there are spheres of responsibility in every relationship and in every job. And so knowing your sphere of responsibility and then getting it done, that's part of being a good person, a good believer, just a Christian person that follows Christ. So then verse 2, now isn't Boaz, whose young women, and remember Boaz now means strength, isn't Boaz, whose young women you were with, our relatives, our relative? And of course, we know it's already come up about him being a kinsman redeemer. Look, he's winnowing barley tonight on the threshing floor. So there's a couple things we know about this right away, and then a couple things that are kind of confusing. And the scholars discuss it. And the fact of the matter is, there's no easy solution to this, but it says he's winnowing barley tonight on the threshing floor. Well, remember that the first harvest was the barley harvest, and that you needed the sheaf of barley in order to wave for the Passover celebration, the first of the barley harvest, for the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So he's winnowing barley tonight, but take a look a chapter back. Take a look at Ruth chapter 2 in the very last verse. So verse 22, Naomi's encouraging Ruth, it's good that you go out with Boaz's young women. Verse 23, so she, Naomi, stayed close to Boaz's young women, gleaning until the end of the barley harvest and the wheat harvest. And she lived with her mother-in-law. Now, wait a minute. The end of the barley harvest was usually sometime in mid to late April. The end of the wheat harvest was sometime in June. So if she's gleaning until the end of the wheat harvest, then why, when Ruth chapter 3 opens, is Boaz winnowing barley? And the fact of the matter is, we don't really know. We don't have a solid answer for that. There have been a number of things that have been proposed. I think perhaps the most logical is that the last verse in Ruth chapter 22 is a summary statement letting us know about Ruth's working, that she worked through the barley harvest and she worked through the wheat harvest. And then Ruth chapter 3, verse 1 starts with the word and we know the word and doesn't have to be immediately temporal. So, and Naomi said, now isn't Boaz, whose young women were with you, our relative? And when we look at that, by the way, verse 2, it's well known among scholars that the book of Ruth is a masterful piece of literature. Because think a second, here's Ruth, she's a Moabite. She doesn't know a whole lot about Judah. And so what is Naomi doing asking her a question? Why is Naomi saying, now isn't Boaz, the young whose young women you were with, our relative? Why doesn't she say, Boaz, you were with his young women, he's a relative? Why does she make it a question? And what's been pointed out is the question is really for us. The question pulls the reader in to the conversation. It makes us more a part of what's going on here, because then we ask ourselves the question as we read it, and we end up in the scene by ourselves. And then Naomi goes on, look, he's winnowing barley tonight on the threshing floor. Couple things about this. First of all, they started winnowing in the late afternoon, and probably most of you have been in the woods. I know when I was growing up as a kid, we did a lot of camping out. Dad and Mom loved to camp. We did a lot of camping, and you could have the afternoon sunlight and the afternoon heat, and then the sun would start to go down, and you could feel the air shift. And maybe you've been out in the woods and felt that, but you feel the air shift. You feel the evening breeze start to pick up, and there's a start of an evening breeze. So when it says he's winnowing barley tonight, it's not talking about the dead of night, because if any of you have gone out in the dead of night, and most of you have, and you go out and stand, usually there's an evening breeze as the air above the earth cools down. The earth is still giving off a lot of heat, and that produces air currents. But as you move into the depth of night, the wind stops and everything's really still. So when it says he's winnowing barley tonight, that's really the late afternoon and the early evening on the threshing floor. And as we see, that'll actually work into the story here. So he's winnowing barley tonight on the threshing floor. And so that means that Naomi will know where Boaz is, and he'll be reachable where you could talk to him by himself. In his house, that would be very difficult. There would be other people all over the place. This will be a place where Ruth will actually be able to approach Boaz and have a conversation with him without other people being there. So he's winnowing barley tonight on the threshing floor. By the way, I'm assuming you guys, I better describe winnowing just that, when you harvested the grain, so now you've got the stalks of grain, the first thing you want to do is thresh the grain, and that gets the grain off the stalk. So now you've got the little pieces of grain, but they're all mixed up with the stalk. So if you have if you don't want too heavy a wind, and you can't do it in no wind, but you want a medium light wind, and you just take what's called a winnowing fork. Basically looks like a pitchfork, except the tines are broad, so they get underneath the grain, and you throw it up in the air, and the little pieces of grain, which are like rice, little round guys, they basically fall straight back down, and what's called the chaff, the broken pieces of the stalk, the wind blows them away. That is a very common biblical metaphor, if you will, or illustration. It comes up. We ought to look real quick at Psalm 1. And we can see this illustration in Psalm 1. And it says, verse 3, he, the righteous, will be like a tree planted by the streams of water. By the way, the word planted there is a little difficult because it doesn't say he'll be like a tree growing by the streams of water. He will grow by the streams of water, but it's very important to understand that the word planted there, you could even translate it transplanted. In other words, the righteous person, it's like God picks you up and puts you by the spiritual water where you are fed. It's not that you just happen to grow there. So the righteous person is like a tree planted by the streams of water that brings forth fruit in its season, whose leaf doesn't wither. Whatever he does, he prospers. It's not so with the wicked, because they are like the chaff that the wind drives away. And then you look for them and they're gone. And so this is the chaff, that's the broken piece of the grain. So back into Ruth chapter 3, when you winnow barley or wheat or whatever grain you're winnowing, you're left with the little grains of wheat, and the chaff is blown away. Verse 3, Naomi says to Ruth, so wash yourself, anoint yourself, put on your nice garment, and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. So much in this verse to unpack. First of all, people in that culture typically didn't wash very often. They weren't, clean nerds like we are, where a lot of people take a bath every day or at least every other day. And, we're constantly washing our face and our hair and that kind of stuff. They didn't really do that in that culture, but they definitely did it before marriage. And so what's going on here is this is a preparation for a marriage proposal. Now, you could say, well, it doesn't say that in the text. No, it doesn't. It's so common that it was just part of the culture. It was understood. So Naomi here it's interesting. She says, shouldn't I try to find rest for you? But really what she has to do in this situation is she has to position Ruth so that she can make the proposal. So she says, verse 3, you wash yourself, anoint yourself. The anointing was very important because Ruth is going to come to Boaz at night. In fact, when Boaz first discovers that Ruth is there, he doesn't even know who she is. So he can't see her really well. So he's not really seeing the nice dress and all that stuff. What he can do very clearly is smell her anointing oil, and he gets the idea of what's going on. So wash yourself, anoint yourself, put on your nice garment, go down to the threshing floor because the city of Bethlehem was up on a hill. The threshing floors were down in the grain growing area to the east and down in a lower elevation. So literally when it says go down to the threshing floor, that's literally true geographically. Then she makes this interesting statement. Do not make yourself known to the man until he is finished eating and drinking. In other words, you want to make sure that he's full, he's satisfied, he's started to rest for the night. That the timing of this is really important. And I think sometimes in our busy culture, we are not super good at paying attention to the timing of things. And it's something that takes discipline, self-control. Ecclesiastes has that entire thing about time. We could take a quick look at it because I think it speaks to this here as well. So if you take a hop to Ecclesiastes chapter 3, and in Ecclesiastes chapter 3 and verse 1, for everything there is a season, a time for every matter under heaven. And that's really true. And sometimes the time isn't yet, and we need to pause. So verse 2, time to be born, time to die, time to plant, uproot what was planting, time to kill, time to heal, time to tear down, time to build up, time to weep, time to laugh, time to mourn, time to dance, time to cast away stones like when you're clearing your field, time to gather stones like when you're building a wall, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. That's really true. We kind of instinctively feel that, but it's an important part of living life. A time to search and a time to count it as lost, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to sow. And then I like this next phrase, a time to be silent and a time to speak. That's a tough one for us in our Western culture because we get so involved in wanting to convince the other person of our point of view. So many times we don't hear them out. We don't just kind of shut our mouths and listen and focus. What are they saying? Why would they be saying that? We'll have time to speak. But this is a big deal for our Western culture, a time to be silent, time to speak, and time to love, time to hate, and onward. So we go back to Ruth chapter 3. And so here Naomi's guidance is don't make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. There's a proper time to approach him. Then verse 4, then when he lies down, you are to note the place where he is lying, and you are to go and uncover the place of his feet and lie there, and then he will tell you what you are to do. And she said, all that you say, I will do. So she's committed. Now let's go back to verse 4, because I thought, how in the world did she even pull this off? Because because of the grain that was available on the threshing floor at this particular time, and different people, of course, wanted the grain. I mean, there's always thieves around. But the threshing floor would have visitors, unwanted visitors. Some would be people hanging out, trying to figure out how they could get some, swoop in, grab some free grain and make off with it. But there were also prostitutes that would come to the threshing floor. And so Ruth it would really backfire on Ruth as far as her reputation in the village and that kind of thing if people thought she was trying to be a prostitute. And so she's got to stay hidden, and Boaz makes that clear. We'll see that in more clarity here in another couple of verses. But when Naomi says, "Do not make yourself known to the man," that includes, don't be seen, and she wasn't. And how she pulled that off, I I don't know and can't imagine. How do you approach the threshing floor without being spotted and made out for who you are, and then get close enough to see where Boaz is going to lie down? Um, I'll tell you, there's a lot of planning that went into this that isn't here in the text. So, verse 4, when he lies down, you are to note the place where he is lying, and you are to go and uncover the place of his feet and lie down. And it's this translation, uncover the place of his feet. The REV is the only version I could find that has that. And yet, if you check the lexicons, and I checked a number of them, I checked Halot, I checked Brown Driver Briggs, I checked New American Standard 2020, Greek Hebrew Dictionary. I checked a lot of different places. The word here is not just the feet, although it can stand for the feet, but it's the place of the feet. Now, why is that important in this context? And it's important because there's so many words here that do double duty. Like when we talk about, I slept with a man or I slept with a woman. Well, we don't mean sleep. We mean had sex. And the Hebrew Bible is rich with that kind of stuff. So, for example, to uncover someone is often to have sex with them. You see that in Leviticus particularly. And it says she uncovered. And then the word feet is a very common idiom for the genital area in the Bible. And you can see this in a number of verses. Let's take a look at a couple of them just to see what's going on here. Isaiah chapter 7. If we go to Isaiah chapter 7, and this is a very interesting verse because it speaks to the cruelty of the Assyrian invaders. Isaiah lived in the time of the Assyrians and the Assyrian conquest of Israel because of Israel abandoning Yahweh, turning to idols, that kind of thing. Then they walked out from underneath Yahweh's protection, and as a result, they were attacked and conquered by the Assyrians, which were, even by Middle Eastern standards, perhaps the most cruel nation. As a nation, they were very cruel that was in that part of the world. And so if you look at verse 20, God speaking about the day of judgment upon Israel, and it says, verse 20, and that day the Lord will shave with a razor hired from regions beyond the Euphrates River. That is shaved by the king of Assyria, because the Assyrians and the country of Assyria was on the northeastern side of the Euphrates River. So from Israel, the Assyrians are from the regions beyond the Euphrates River. So the Lord's going to shave with a razor. That means whatever's going to happen to Israel, it's going to be close. There's going to be a lot of damage. It's not going to leave Israel much, just like a razor doesn't leave much hair. And that is shaved by the king of Assyria. The head, and watch this, the head and the hair of the feet. Now, I'm amazed that there's so many English versions that say the hair of the legs. I don't even have a clue why they would translate it like that. First of all, it's the Hebrew word for feet. And secondly, the Assyrians weren't interested in shaving the hair of the legs. That wasn't the point. The point was to embarrass and mock the captives. And so what they would do is they would shave the pubic hair of their captives. I mean, it was horrific, really, because obviously they didn't take much care to do a super good job. But in any case, that's one of the things that we see testified in history. So God had pronounced that this would happen, that the Assyrians would come in and they were very cruel, and they would actually take their captives and strip them naked and shave their pubic hair. And then also sweep away the beard would go as well. If you look at 2 Kings chapter 18, and we'll just do this one here, and then if you want more on this in the REV commentary on Isaiah 7:20, there's a lot more on this. But anyway, 2 Kings and chapter 18 and verse 27. And this is the Assyrian attack on Judah, because after the Assyrians were through with Israel, they came to attack Judah. Now, they did a lot of damage, but they didn't destroy Judah like they destroyed Israel. Verse 27, but Rabshakeh, now he's one of the top men of the Assyrian army, said to them, has my lord, the lord of Rabshakeh was the king of Assyria, has my lord sent me to your lord, who is Hezekiah the king, to speak these words? Is it not the men who sit on the wall, who will have to eat their own dung and drink their own urine with you? So Rabshakeh is talking to the people from Hezekiah, King Hezekiah, trying to get them to surrender. And he says, we're going to surround your city, siege your city. You're going to starve. You're going to eat your own dung and drink your own urine. The word urine in the Hebrew text is an idiom. It's literally, and drink the water of your feet with you, because urine was called the water of the feet. And so again, we see the Hebrew idiom about feet. Now, why this is important then is because when we go back to Ruth chapter 3, and in verse 4, Naomi's coaching Ruth, and she says, when he lies down, you are to note the place where he is lying, and you to go and uncover, and most versions just say uncover his feet, and then go read the commentaries, and there's a good percentage of them that say, well, Ruth is going to go and have sex with Boaz. She's going to go and strip naked and seduce Boaz. She's going to uncover his feet, meaning have sex with him. But that's not what the Hebrew text says. It says uncover the place of his feet. And that becomes important because it diffuses some of the sexual imagery here, because Ruth is not going to the threshing floor to seduce Boaz. So, uncover the place of his feet and lie down, then he will teach you what you are to do. Verse 5, and she said to her, all that you say I will do. Verse 6, so she went down to the threshing floor and did according to all that her mother-in-law commanded her. And again, she went down to the threshing floor. How she exactly got there and how she kept herself from being recognized, I don't know. That's just an amazing kind of background that I'd love to hear someday. Verse 7, when Boaz had eaten and drunk, and his heart was merry, he went to lie down at the edge of the heap of grain. Now, when it says his heart was merry, there are some more liberal scholars that say he was probably drunk. Thankfully, the conservative scholars say, no, he wasn't drunk. He was satisfied. He was happy. But the whole reason he's there is to help guard his grain. That completely loses its significance if he's going to get drunk, because somebody would just walk up and take the grain while he's lying there in a stupor. So he's happy, he's blessed, his heart was merry, he was satisfied, if you will. Then he's just going to go and lay down. So he went and lay down at the edge of the heap of grain, obviously getting close to it. You want to be close enough that you are aware if somebody's trying to steal some. And so then it says in verse 7, then she, Ruth, came silently, uncovered the place of his feet, and lay down. And that, it shows you, God has to have his hand of help on this, because how she could uncover the place of his feet and they lay down there without waking him up, but he didn't wake up. But I don't know if you're like, if I wake up at night because I've kicked my covers off and my feet are cold, I wake up. I don't, if my feet get cold, I don't sleep well. So I really identify with this, because you get that kind of warm late afternoon air, and it turns to that really got a chill night air, and Ruth has uncovered his feet. And so he's going to get cold and he's going to get uncomfortable. And so verse 8, it came to pass at midnight that the man trembled. And it is true that this word can be trembled with fear or trembled just because his body is shivering, he's cold. I think the context demands that he's shivering because he's cold. He might also have some kind of alarm going off, because it's like, well, it's not every night I kick the covers off. What's going on here? So there may be a kind of a mixture of being a little apprehensive with being cold. The Bible doesn't exactly explain it. It simply says that he trembled. So it came to pass at midnight, the man trembled and turned himself, and behold, and I like that there. It's just, it grabs you. And behold, a woman was lying at his feet. Verse 9, so he said, who are you? And my gut feeling is that it would be great if we had a recording of this, because I think, when it says who are you, that he he was startled. This wasn't the middle of the day and he was all calm and stuff like that, and he's definitely startled. So he says, who are you? And he literally, he didn't know. I mean, why would he? It's dark out. He hadn't seen Ruth in that kind of circumstances before. She had her big cloak on. So he said, who are you? And she answered, I am Ruth, your servant. Now, this becomes important, because when she says, I am Ruth, your servant, she's using the word Amma, which is the more elevated word for servant. If you remember in chapter 2, when she was talking to Boaz and she said, I am your servant, she used the word shifcha, which is, that was the lowest servant in the household. That was the female slave of the wife of the house. That was as low as you could get. She's elevated herself considerably here. And she says, I am Ruth, your servant, Amma. And that's where, when a wife would say to the husband, I'm your servant, or that kind of thing, that's the word they would use. So she's elevating herself by her vocabulary to the position of someone that could be married. The shifka, you'd never marry her. She is just like, the lowest possible slave on the totem pole type of thing. But the Amma, then when he heard that word, he would, especially since he'd had earlier conversations with her when she would not call herself that he would have been kind of instantly aware of the fact that, okay, she in her mind and in her estimation, she has stepped up in the world. So he says, she says, I am Ruth, your servant. Please spread the wing of your cloak over your servant, because you're a kinsman redeemer. And spreading the wing of your cloak, and the wing there is the cloaks usually split down the middle, so they kind of flapped. If you've ever had a bathrobe, it kind of flaps, and so that was called the wing of the cloak. And this comes up also in other places. If you look at Ezekiel chapter 16, we'll see the same kind of thing here and what's going on in Ezekiel chapter 16. This is God, and he is going to marry Israel. And so in Ezekiel 16, he's giving kind of a history of Israel. If you look at verse 3, your origin and birth is of the land of the Canaanite, the Amorite was your father, your mother was a Hittite. These are early on in the origin of Israel. For example, Judah married Jacob had 12 sons. His son Judah married a Canaanite wife back in those real early days before Israel, kind of exploded in population. They married among the population around them. And so he says, your origin, your birth was of the land of the Canaanite, that kind of thing. And so then he says in verse 8, now when I passed by you, says God, and looked at you, behold, your time was the time for love, and I spread the corner of my garment over you and covered your nakedness. And so this is God saying, I entered into a marriage covenant with you. I married you. We entered into a marriage covenant because I spread the corner of my garment over you. I covered your nakedness, and I swore to you and entered into a covenant with you, says the Lord Yahweh, and you became mine. So this is the same phraseology that Ruth is going to use. Let's go back to Ruth chapter 3. It's the same kind of phraseology that Ruth is going to use when she says in verse 9, please spread the wing of your cloak over your servant because you're a kinsman redeemer. And one of the things I love about this is just the simple boldness. Once again, there are times when if we want something done, we've got to make our will clear. We've got to speak out what we want. We've got to be bold in the world. James says, you do not have because you do not ask. And that's really true in so many situations. We don't have what we'd like because we don't ask. And here, Ruth is unabashedly, boldly saying to Boaz, marry me. Now, ordinarily, you would think, well, it's the man's job to come to the woman. But in this case, and if you look at the commentary on Ruth, one of the things that you find is that the men in the genealogy tend to be quite old. They're late 80s up to 90 and sometimes perhaps even over 100. So it's very likely here, I was thinking about this today, it's very likely here that Boaz would not have asked Ruth. I mean, you've got a man who's probably somewhere close to 90, maybe a little younger, maybe a little older. And then you've got Ruth, married at 14, 10 years in Moab. She's in her mid-20s. So you got a 90-year-old man. Is he really going to go to Ruth in her mid-20s and say, I'd like to marry you? I think that just, being a guy thinking about that, I'd say, she'd say no. Who would want to do that? And so I'm fairly certain that he would have never asked. And I think Naomi knew that, and I think Ruth knew that. And I think that's why Ruth here had to be aggressive and had to ask. And she did in a very, very clear way. Spread the wing of your cloak over your servant because you're a kinsman redeemer. And as we read the record, it's very interesting because, and as we read the record, we find out he doesn't do it. It's not in the text. And so the question is, why? Because Boaz knows what Ruth doesn't know at this time, which is Boaz can't commit to marrying her because there's a kinsman redeemer who's closer than Boaz is. So it's interesting. Ruth asks, spread your cloak over me, and Boaz never responds to that. Now, did he cover her up just because she would probably get cold? Maybe, but maybe not, because she had on her thick outer garment. Remember when Naomi was telling her how to dress, take your robe and all that stuff. And we'll see in the next verses that she had a robe. So he may have never covered her up. That would be completely possible. So verse 10, but he responds, may you be blessed by Yahweh, my daughter. Now that shows his affection for her. He's expressing his affection. He's opening his heart to her. in relationships, especially you're just starting into a relationship, you're very sensitive toward words of encouragement. Am I being encouraged in this, or am I being discouraged in this? And so what Ruth is hearing here has got to light her up, has got to warm her heart. May you be blessed by Yahweh, my daughter. And then he makes a very interesting statement. You've shown more devotion at the end than at the beginning. And what is the end? The end is now. In other words, you've shown more devotion now than in the beginning when you first came here, because that was, you simply stuck with Naomi, and that's devotion. That's definitely devotion. But now you're trying to work out how you and Naomi can be taken care of. And by asking me to marry you, that's, I mean, you ladies put yourself in, say a 25-year-old girl looking at marrying a 90-year-old man. What kind of commitment does that take? That's really what you're looking at. And he said, you've shown more devotion at the end than the beginning, and that you did not go after young men, whether poor or rich. You didn't go after young men. The poor ones would probably marry you for love, and you'd have love, but no real substance. Or rich, and you could marry a rich man and a young man, and you'd have some sustenance, but there's no guarantee he wouldn't pick up other wives, or he would treat you nicely, or whatever. So he says, you've shown more devotion at this time than at the beginning. You didn't go after love. You didn't go after a young man who seemed to be wealthy. And so that was very important. And he said, may you be blessed by Yahweh. And I love that. Verse 11. Now, my daughter, and he calls her daughter again, do not be afraid. And she would have plenty to be afraid of. And one of the things that she could have been afraid of, we don't think about this typically, but we've got to remember that in that culture, they just didn't do things individually. They did things as part of a family, even part of a clan. They thought that way, and they needed to, because you didn't have, you couldn't just call 911 and have a ambulance show up and take you to a hospital. There was no police force. The thing that kept you and your stuff protected was your large family that was around you. The people that took care of you if you were sick was your large family and the people who were around you. And so it was very important to have the support of a family in that culture. And Ruth was a Moabite, and the Israelites had recently had some pretty rough dealings with the Moabites. So even if Boaz accepted, which apparently he did, and said, I will see what I can do here. Even if he accepted, was that a guarantee that his family, his clan would accept her? And she wouldn't know, but Boaz would have a better feel for that. So he said, now my daughter, do not be afraid. I will do for you all that you say. And again, in our culture, it's just a man and a woman. They say they'll marry each other, and they do. In that culture, it wasn't so easy. There were things there were hurdles you had to clear. Boaz needed to make sure that the near kinsman redeemer didn't want to marry Ruth. He wanted to make sure his clan would accept Ruth, that kind of thing. He says, I will do all that you say. And then he makes this interesting statement. For all the gate of my people knows that you are a woman of noble character. And I love, see, again, look at the clan think in this, if you will, kind of a group think. Why does he say, I will do for you what you say? It's because the gate of my people knows that you're a woman of noble. The gate of my people. What's that? That's the gate of the city. And who sits at the gate? The elders of the city. So the elders of the city are going to sit at the gate. They're the ones that make the decisions for the city. And he says, the people in Bethlehem that make a difference. The different makers, the players, the rich and famous, they're all at the gate. All those gate people know that you're a woman of noble character. Um, Noble character is a standard translation of the Hebrew word, which comes from the word strong. You could actually legitimately translate this as all the gate of my people knows that you're a strong woman. The problem with translating it that way in English is a lot of times a strong woman in our culture is a headstrong woman. Go ahead and get things done, charge ahead, that kind of thing. That would stick out like a sore thumb in that culture because, like I say, they did things as a group. I was on the phone with Peter Miano today, and he's a good friend of mine, and he runs tours to Israel. And Peter is ordained in the Methodist Church, and he was sent by the Methodist Church to to as try to help the different groups in Israel, make nice, get together, be able to talk with each other instead of just fighting and that kind of thing. And Peter told me the story that so he lands in Israel, and his first day on the job, he walks into an Arab village, and there's two groups of men, one sitting on this side, one sitting on that side. Not just individual men, but groups of men. It turns out these are the village elders from one village. These are the village elders from the other village. In the middle of the two groups is a table with one cup of coffee. And the dispute is two of the boys in the village got into a fight. Somebody pulled a knife and cut the other one. So the villages, not the people, but the villages are mad at each other. And so they need to iron that out. And so Peter's watching this develop, and the men are talking back and forth and negotiating back and forth and talking back and forth. And when they're settled, after as long as it took to get everybody to where they could live with whatever agreement they made, then the head elder from one village goes and takes a sip out of the cup of coffee and puts it down. Then the head elder of the other village comes over and takes a sip out of the cup of coffee and sets it down. And then they kind of look at each other and nod, and they all go their own way, and it's completely settled. But even though it's one parent's boy with one parent's boy and getting a bit of a fight, somebody pulls a knife, it wasn't about that. It was about our village is mad at your village, and your village is mad at our village. And that's just the way they thought. And so here, if you said she was a strong woman, it could easily give the wrong impression that she's really a woman that understands how to play in the culture, and she's a woman of noble character. And that's what it's saying here. And so verse 12, now it's true that I'm a kinsman redeemer, but there's also a kinsman redeemer nearer than I. And so that means that other kinsman redeemer had a closer relationship with Elimelech than Boaz did. So verse 13. Now this is interesting. Stay here tonight, and in the morning if he will be for you a kinsman redeemer, well and good. Let him redeem you. But if he will not redeem you, then as Yahweh lives, I will be a kinsman redeemer for you. Lie down until the morning. So now we need to unpack this verse. First of all, he says, stay here tonight. Now, why would he do that? He's said he would take care of the situation. Why doesn't he send Ruth home and say, okay, so head home? And the answer is, remember how late it is in the night. So what kind of people are out walking around at that kind of night? You got the people that are stalking around the grain piles trying to steal grain, thieves, robbers, just yuck people that Boaz doesn't want Ruth leaving the threshing floor and having to walk back alone into the city at the depth of the night. As the light just starts to break in the morning, it'll be a lot safer because people aren't so bold as soon as it starts to get light. So he says, stay here tonight. And in the morning, if he will be a kinsman, if he will be for you a kinsman redeemer. And then the Hebrew text just says tov, good, good. And you can't really leave it like that, because that makes it sound like Boaz doesn't want the job. He doesn't want to be the kinsman redeemer. And if the other guy wants to be the kinsman redeemer, good. I don't have to be. That's not the meaning of the text. In fact, I wrestled with how you translate this. Not only did I wrestle with it, when you look at the other versions, they have the same problem. They understand that if you just put the word good there, and a lot of them do, it can give the wrong impression, like Boaz doesn't want to be the kinsman redeemer, but he does want to be the kinsman redeemer. So basically, how do you express that? And it's very difficult to bring out that nuance exactly. Some of the versions said well and good, and I thought that was a pretty decent way to bring it into English. But basically, it means, that's the way it's going to be. That's the law. That we want to follow the law of Moses. That's the way we're going to follow the law. So, we'll have to make peace with that. And then he says, let him redeem you. But if he will not redeem you, then as Yahweh lives, I will be a kinsman redeemer for you. Lie down until morning. Verse 14, so she lay at his feet until morning. She rose up before one person could recognize another. So the word recognize here, there's pressure on the word recognize. You could see that there were people, you could see them moving around, but you couldn't recognize them. That became very important. Then he said, it must not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor. And again, why would you not want the people to know that a woman came to the threshing floor? Because the women who came to the threshing floor were usually prostitutes, trying to give sex to get grain and that kind of thing. So he doesn't want Ruth caught up in that. He doesn't want to be caught up himself in any kind of scandal. Verse 15, then he said, bring the cloak that you're wearing, and that's what she would have slept under. Bring the cloak that you're wearing and hold it. And we add the word tightly because of what's going to happen next. She held it out, and he measured 6 measures of barley and laid it on her. And then he turns and goes into the city, ostensibly to begin to take care of the situation with being the kinsman redeemer. Now, 6 measures of barley is, to the best of our ability to calculate it, somewhere in the neighborhood of 60 pounds. So that's a lot of barley. Ruth's got to walk uphill back to the city, and she's carrying basically what amounts to, she's taken her cloak and wrapped the barley up in it and is holding it like Boaz says, hold it tight. And she's got to get that 60 pounds of barley back to her mom. Verse 16. When she came to her mother-in-law, she said, how did it go, my daughter? And she told her all the man had done for her. Now, this verse contains an idiom that I just love, because in the Hebrew text, he doesn't say, how did it go, my daughter? The Hebrew text reads, when she came to her mother-in-law, Naomi said, who are you, my daughter? And I love that, because we change who we are based on how safe we feel, how blessed we feel. It's all of us have a little bit of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in us. Things can go wrong in our life and pile up and that kind of thing, and we become very reactive, very terse, hard on people, that kind of thing. Or things can be going right. Our cars are working and things are going right in our lives, and we're happy and we're relaxed and we're nice with people. And when people make a mistake, we don't bite their head off and that kind of stuff. And the Hebrews were very sensitive to that what was going on in your life and in your environment could change the way you interacted with the world around you. And so I think it's very interesting that the idiom is, who are you? And so that's what Naomi asked Ruth, who are you, my daughter? And she told her all the man had done for her. So she's laying all this. And then verse 17, and it's kind of interesting because this doesn't come up in the text until here, verse 17. And she, Ruth, said, he gave me these 6 measures of barley, for he said, don't go empty to your mother-in-law. We put handed in italics just because it's English, but what Boaz says, what don't go empty to your mother-in-law. Now that's not part of the dialogue between Ruth and Boaz. So this is something that Ruth says that Boaz said, and I'm sure Boaz said it, but it's not represented in the text. But it makes a really, really a powerful shift, if you will, because if here she, Boaz says, don't go empty to your mother-in-law. And if you want, then take a look back in chapter 2. And let's see, where to get off to. Yeah, it's, I'm sorry, I said Ruth 2. It's Ruth chapter 1. So back in Ruth chapter 1, here's Naomi, and verse 19, it says, so the two of them, Ruth and Naomi, went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they came to Bethlehem, the whole city was astir about them, and the women said, is this Naomi? But she said to them, do not call me Naomi, pleasant. Call me Mara, bitter. For El Shaddai has dealt very bitterly with me. I went out full, and Yahweh has brought me home again empty. Why do you call me pleasant, since Yahweh has testified against me? So she says, I went out full, now I've come back empty. And we go to Ruth chapter 3, and what do we see? That Boaz says, don't go empty to your mother-in-law. Take all this barley and bless her and fill her up, if you will. In verse 18, then Naomi said, sit still, my daughter, until you know how the matter turns out, for the man will not rest until he has settled the matter today. That speaks of Naomi's trust in Boaz, that he was a man of his word. And I love how she started verse 18 with, sit still, my daughter, because there's times when we just get so nervous, we just don't sit still. And sometimes we just have to pray and let the Lord work. There's times, and I love the back and forth in Ruth, because there's times when she's got to be aggressive and she's got to be bold and she's got to be right on it and she's got to speak her mind. And then there's times where she's got to sit and be still and let the Lord work and let people do what they say they were going to do. And life is a give and take that way. You know, sometimes put your foot on the gas, sometimes put your foot on the brake, and then we're always trying to figure out what do I need to do now? Do I need a little more gas or a little more brake? And that shows up. So this was Ruth chapter 3. We've got one more chapter of Ruth, and we'll do that next week and get into Ruth chapter 4 and the close of the chapter. That reminds me of something I didn't point out. In verse 17, it says, and she Ruth said, he gave me these 6 measures of barley, for he said, do not go empty-handed to your mother-in-law. These are the last words of Ruth in the book of Ruth. And in studying the book of Ruth and realizing those are Ruth's last words in the book of Ruth, and I almost felt like cheated. I was like, what? I mean, isn't there like a goodbye, or they lived happily ever after, or she loved being married to Boaz, or she was really rejoicing that Naomi was taken care of? I mean, something. So I really, I reflected on that. It's like, God, what is going on here? I mean, the last words. And one of the first things that I think is important here is in the last words of Ruth, she's talking about caring for her mother-in-law. These are God's words. I mean, I'm sure Ruth said a lot. So when God authored the scripture and put these in the scripture, there's a lesson here, because, like I said, I'm sure she said a lot. God could have filled paragraphs here with what she actually said. But this is what came out, and this is the last. And I thought, gosh, that that her last words have to do with caring for somebody else. What a great legacy to leave behind. That you leave behind this. That's going to be like your mark. That's what she did when she came back with Naomi from Moab to begin with, and with her last words in the book, she's taking care of Naomi. And another thing I thought about was how fragile our lives are. We really never know what our last words are going to be, and it's a good reason to watch our words and pick our words carefully, because we know from Proverbs, there is the one that speaks like the piercing of the sword, but the tongue of the wise is healing. And our words can really make a difference and help people. But I just as I am keep looking for things that Ruth said and realized this is the last thing she said. It was it hit me pretty deeply. Interesting. It's why you've got to read this stuff over and over. I don't think I'd ever noticed that before. And you read it over and over, and God just kind of bubbles stuff up to the surface for you to see and be blessed by. So anyway, I'm going to have my last words. I need to stop, or I'll just roll around. Okay, thank you guys all for being here. This has been a joy. I'm looking forward to next Tuesday night. I've already started to work Ruth chapter 4. I'm excited about it already. So there's good stuff in there too. So God bless you all. Thank you.